He didn't just toss it aside. He laughed. My own son, standing in front of his wife and friends, flung my gift across the room like it was trash. Like I was trash. But what he didn't know is that the thing he mocked, the thing he called junk, once saved dozens of lives. Including his. My name is Nadine Langley. I'm a mother, a widow. And before all of that, I was a colonel in the United States Army. I led teams into places no one wanted to go. I carried bodies, saved civilians, made choices no headline ever captured. But none of that mattered at my own son's dinner table. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about how dignity survives silence, and how one quiet mother reminded the world who she really was. If you've ever been dismissed, erased, or underestimated, stay with me. You deserve to hear this. My son never actually told me not to come, but he never truly told me to either. That's the strange ache of motherhood sometimes. When silence becomes louder than words, when the absence of an invitation feels like a door slowly closing one hinge at a time. Travis had always been a man of few words, even as a boy, but back then his silences were full of trust. Now they felt loaded with distance. The birthday message arrived in a group chat named Family and Friends. Just 10 words buried between balloons and confetti emojis. Birthday drinks for Travis. This Saturday. Drop by if you're around. No. Mom, I'd love to see you. No address even. Just the assumption that those who needed to know already knew. I stared at that message longer than I'd admit. I even closed my phone and opened it again, hoping for a follow-up, something more personal. But nothing came. Just another forwarded flyer from Melissa about her charity gala next month. Still, I packed my bag the next morning. Not a suitcase, just a small military duffel I'd kept from my last deployment. It had faded names stitched into the inner lining, names of people I'd once led through sandstorms and sniper alleys. Now it would carry something gentler. The gift I chose wasn't much by most standards. No fancy labels, no receipts to show off. But every item inside carried weight that only a mother could understand. First, the handkerchief. I had embroidered it myself. Light blue stitching on ivory fabric. His initials curled into one corner. T. W. L. I had chosen that thread carefully. It was military-grade fire-resistant, the kind used in combat zones to reinforce seams and bandages. I had kept a spool tucked in my sewing kit for years, never finding the right moment to use it. Until now. Second, 2 ration bars from a batch I had quietly saved from my final overseas mission. Still sealed, still safe, still the peanut butter flavor Travis used to love as a boy. He used to steal them from my bag when I came home on leave. He'd call them Mom's Power Snacks and beg for one before bed. I remembered him maybe 8 years old, sneaking into the kitchen with crumbs on his lip and saying I just needed a soldier snack. Mom, last the letter? A real letter. Not typed, not digital. 3 pages written in ink on heavy stock paper that smelled faintly of cedar. I had rewritten it 4 times, crossed things out, started over, cried a little. In the final version, I told him things I had never been brave enough to say aloud. I told him I was proud, not just of his job or the house or the promotion, but of the man he once was. The little boy who held my hand after his first school fight. The teenager who waited up for me when my transport was delayed in a snowstorm. I reminded him that even when I was thousands of miles away, crouched in sand beside strangers, I never stopped seeing him in my mind's eye. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it beneath the handkerchief, then closed the box and wrapped it in plain brown paper. Sturdy, like field parcels used to be. I tied it with the same blue thread. No bows, no ribbon, just strength and softness in one simple knot. People might say it wasn't enough, but I know what it was, a package of memory, of care, of years that no one else saw but me. The bus station in Great Falls was nearly empty when I boarded. I took a window seat near the middle as I always do. Close enough to the exit in case something went wrong, far enough not to be bothered by noise. The duffel sat by my feet, the box snug inside. The trip stretched on for 2 full days. Through Wyoming's wind, Colorado's sprawl, Oklahoma's long gray highways. Every stop added a new silence to the journey. I didn't talk to anyone, not even the driver. Just stared out the window, remembering the last time I'd been to Houston. It had been years. Travis had just bought the house. Melissa had been newly pregnant with their first. They were busy, of course. I slept on a futon in the guest room and left the next morning before anyone was up. No one seemed to notice. I told myself it was fine, that young families needed space. But the truth settled in slowly, like rain on old canvas. I wasn't being asked to give them space. I was being written out of the picture frame by frame. Somewhere past Dallas, I found myself staring at the gift again. I had taken it out of the bag during a long layover and held it on my lap like it might vanish if I let go. I caught a teenage girl watching me from the row across. She had pink headphones and a half-eaten candy bar. She tilted her head and asked, "Is that for someone special?" I smiled. "My son." She blinked. "Cool. Is he in the military too?" I didn't correct her. I didn't explain that I wasn't in uniform anymore. I just said, "No. He's building his own life now." When I arrived in Houston, the heat met me like a wall. I had forgotten how humid it was here, how quickly sweat could cling to your neck before you even stepped outside. I hailed a ride to Travis's address, the same one listed on a real estate website I had checked a few months prior. The driver didn't speak, which suited me just fine. I watched the neighborhoods change from modest to magnificent in just 10 minutes. The lawns became more sculpted, the fences taller, the houses wider and more symmetrical, like magazine pages printed in brick. We turned into a gated community lined with palm trees and mailbox sculptures. The sign read, "Whispering Pines Estates." It didn't whisper, it screamed money. When the car pulled into Travis's driveway, I almost didn't recognize the house. 3 stories tall glass windows, a Spanish tile roof. A fountain out front gurgled quietly beside a manicured rose bush. I stepped out, brushed the wrinkles from my blouse, and adjusted my duffel over one shoulder. The gift remained in my hands, snug and small. I stood at the front door, staring at the brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. My reflection blinked back at me in the polished glass. I hadn't worn makeup. I hadn't curled my hair. I didn't think I needed to. Just as I lifted my hand to knock, the door swung open. She wasn't Travis. She wasn't Melissa. She wasn't anyone I knew. Mid-30s, tall, slim, crisp makeup, beige linen shirt tucked perfectly into slacks. Her expression was composed, pleasant even, but utterly void of warmth. "Hi," she said, almost like a question. Then her eyes darted down to the box in my hands and back up to my face. "You must be Travis's mother." I nodded. "They're out back," she added, already turning away. "You can go around through the side gate. Please remove your shoes if you're stepping onto the patio." I stood there a second longer than I should have, stunned, not by her words, but by her tone, by the precision of her detachment. No welcome, no "let me show you," just protocol. I looked down at my boots. They weren't pretty. They had been with me through dirt and rain and blistered miles. They were mine. I nodded, said nothing, and turned toward the gate. The gravel crunched underfoot. As I rounded the side of the house, my fingers brushed against the edge of the box. It was still warm from my hands, still tied tight with blue thread. I hadn't come for fanfare. I hadn't come to be honored or photographed. I came because I was his mother. And I wanted him to have something from me. Something real. Something from before the noise, before the curated life and silent distance. Even if he didn't ask for it, even if he didn't see it, I had come this far, and I was going to give it to him. The back patio shimmered like a page torn from a design magazine. Lanterns hung from twisted cords of fairy lights, casting soft glows over manicured hedges and perfectly arranged platters of hors d'oeuvres. I could smell rosemary and lemon, probably infused in the water, not the food. Every glass was crystal. Every smile was curated. I stood at the edge for a moment out of sight. No one noticed me arrive. People were laughing softly, swirling wine in tall glasses, talking about real estate market swings and some gala. Melissa was organizing for a private school fund. Travis stood near the center, dressed in a tailored blue button-down slacks that probably cost more than my week's pension, and that expression he'd started wearing in recent years. Half pride, half performance. He looked happy. Or maybe comfortable. Maybe settled is the better word. Like a man who had crafted a life where nothing unexpected could touch him. I adjusted my grip on the gift and stepped forward. He saw me before I said anything. His smile faltered for just a second. Barely a breath. But I saw it. His eyes flicked downward, registering the brown-wrapped box. Then they shifted to the woman beside him. Melissa standing in nude heels and a white dress, clutching a glass of rosé like it was a crown. She noticed me next. "Oh," she said, blinking. "Travis, your mother's here." I nodded. "Hi, sweetheart. Happy birthday." I reached out and gently placed the box in his hands. My fingers lingered for a moment, not grasping, just steadying. He looked at it like it had weight he didn't want to carry. "What is it?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone who's already made up their mind. "It's just something small," I said. "Something personal." I should have said more. I should have told him about the hours I spent embroidering the handkerchief, the memory stitched into that thread, the way my hands shook when I folded the letter. But I didn't. I didn't want to sell it to him like a pitch. I just wanted him to open it and feel something. He peeled back the paper casually, one corner at a time. Melissa leaned in. A few of their friends glanced over mid-conversation. The moment he opened the lid, everything changed. He pulled out the ration bar first, still in its foil wrapper tucked beside the scarf. There was a pause, a long, fragile pause. Then Melissa gave a short laugh. "Wait, is that field food?" Someone near the drinks table chuckled. Another voice added, "Retro military chic." Travis stared at the contents expression, unreadable. He turned the scarf in his hands like it might unravel under his gaze. And then he said it. "What is this? Cheap junk." He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The words dropped heavy and sharp. Then, without looking at me, he let the box slide from his hands. It hit the marble floor with a muffled thud. The scarf spilled out soft and folded, curling slightly as it landed. The letter didn't even make it out of the box. Just sat there silent. I watched him the whole time. I didn't blink. Melissa didn't look horrified, just vaguely amused. A few people nearby turned away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. The music kept playing. I didn't move to pick it up. My feet stayed planted. My hands clasped gently in front of me. 12 years. 12 years in active service. 15 if you counted the training and the deployments. I had carried wounded men across minefields. I had written last letters home for soldiers who wouldn't make it to sunrise. I had comforted civilians with shaking hands and buried too many names to remember. But nothing had ever felt like this. Not betrayal, not even hurt. Just absence. Like I had been erased. Travis looked at me then. Not with rage, not even with regret. Just a flicker of something. Faint, uncomfortable. Maybe shame dressed up as irritation. "Mom," he said low and flat, "we're in the middle of something. Could you maybe—" "Not right now. Not right now." Like I had knocked on the wrong door. At the wrong time. With the wrong face. I nodded. Just once. My voice didn't crack. I didn't try to explain. I didn't kneel down to gather the gift like some forgotten guest picking up broken plates. I turned around, walked back through the garden, out the same side gate I came in through. No one followed. No one called out. Not even Travis. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I heard the faint sound of laughter behind me. Not cruel, not mocking, just moving on. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even when I reached the bus depot and sat alone on a metal bench, my bag heavier now for all the words I hadn't spoken. Instead, I closed my eyes and thought of my son as a boy, how he used to run to the door when I came home in uniform, how he used to beg me to tell stories of places I'd seen, how he once wrapped his arms around my waist and said, "Don't ever let anyone tell you you're not strong." And now here I was, invisible in plain sight. I stayed there until the sun went down and the streetlights buzzed overhead. Then I stood, wiped the sweat from my hands on my pants, and walked toward the nearest station. I didn't look back, because there was nothing behind me worth seeing. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Instead, I found a small motel 3 exits off the highway tucked between a closed-down diner and a bait shop, the kind of place that didn't ask questions, didn't care where you came from, only if your card would swipe. The clerk handed me the key like he'd handed out 1,000 just like it. Room 6. Bottom floor. The AC unit rattled like a nervous cough. The curtains barely closed all the way. Still, it was quiet. And that was all I needed. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, still wearing the same blouse from earlier, the one I'd ironed so carefully before the trip. It smelled faintly of lavender detergent. Now it smelled like Houston heat and disappointment. I didn't cry, I didn't speak, I didn't call anyone. I just let the stillness settle around me like dust. On the nightstand sat the duffel bag. I reached inside, half expecting to still feel the box in there tucked under the zipper. But it was gone. Gone, like the weight it once held in my chest. Gone like the space I used to fill in my son's life. Instead, I pulled out something I hadn't looked at in years. A folded photograph, creased at the corners, taken during the early days of Operation Iron Veil. The image showed a hazy landscape, burnt trees, tents flapping in the wind, and rows of civilians wrapped in silver thermal blankets. I was there, center frame, crouched beside a girl no older than 7, her face half covered in ash, her arms clinging to my shoulders. She had been pinned under the remnants of a trailer when we found her, flames snapping at the frame. I remembered crawling through a collapsed beam, ignoring protocol, ignoring the order we'd received an hour earlier. Do not engage civilians outside Zone B. Secure only assets and classified cargo. They called it triage. I called it cowardice. I went in anyway. I remembered her voice in my ear, rasped and dry. Don't let go. And I didn't. I carried her on my back for half a mile until we reached the evac convoy. My lungs felt like sandpaper. My vision swam. But we made it. I remember the medics grabbing her from my arms. I remember collapsing face first into the gravel. And I remember silence. Not a thank you, not a commendation, just silence. After that mission, I was asked, no told, to step down. My actions had compromised evacuation protocols and risked exposure of classified routes. I didn't argue. I signed the papers. I walked away with a pension, a stitched-up reputation, and a quiet note in my file that read non-compliant under pressure. I never told Travis, then. How could I? He thought I'd retired early by choice, that I wanted a garden and quiet mornings. He never asked about the scars on my hip or why I still woke in the night gasping. He never questioned why I flinched at sirens or avoided the smell of burning wood. Maybe he didn't want to know. Or maybe I never gave him a reason to. Back in the motel, I booted up the old military-grade laptop I still kept in the bottom of my bag, out of habit, not purpose. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Just a place to rest my thoughts. But then an old message pinged in an encrypted inbox I hadn't touched in months. From S. D. Callahan. Subject: you might want to see this attachment field video Iron Veil capture. MP4. I hesitated. My heart didn't beat faster. Not exactly. But something stirred, something I hadn't felt in years. Readiness. I clicked. The footage was grainy shot from a helmet cam or maybe a drone. Dust and smoke filled the frame. Then, through the haze, a figure emerged. Crawling into a collapsed structure, dragging beams aside, pulling a small child free. Her cries audible even through the static. The figure turned. My face. Younger. Covered in soot. Eyes locked on the camera for a single aching second before disappearing into the smoke again. The girl wrapped around my neck like a second skin. I sat back, watched the video again. And again. There was no name in the caption, no credit, no uniform tags visible. Just a timestamp and an upload trail from a veterans forum now being flooded with shares. Someone had leaked it. Someone remembered. But no one had said my name. It didn't matter. Not really. I wasn't looking for recognition. But something about seeing that moment again, untouched, unfiltered, made the rest of the day feel impossibly small. Travis's voice mocking the gift. The scarf on the marble floor. The unspoken dismissal. It all felt distant. Like noise at the edge of a battlefield. I had walked through fire for a stranger, and my own son couldn't hold a handkerchief. I leaned forward, pressed my palms to my knees, and took one deep breath, the kind we used before night ops, before we stepped into the unknown. Not rage, not revenge, just clarity. He didn't know who I was, but someone did, and maybe it was time to remember who that woman was myself. The video had a life of its own now. By morning it had traveled farther than I ever could. From veterans forums to social media pages reposted by advocacy groups, even featured in a short compilation under the title Unknown Hero Saves Child from Toxic Fire. People called it haunting. Brave. Anonymous Angel was one caption. Others guessed I was military. Some said it looked like an old rescue op forgotten by time. No one knew my name, and that for a while felt safer. Until someone did. It started with a missed call from an unknown number. Then another. I ignored them both. But the third time a voicemail was left. I sat on the motel bed, thumb hovering, before finally pressing play. Hi, this is Elise Tran. I'm an independent reporter with Verity Wire. I believe you're the woman in the Iron Veil footage. If I'm wrong, I apologize. But someone who served with you confirmed your identity. There was a pause. Her voice softened. I'm not calling for a story. I'm calling because the girl in that video? She's been looking for you. I froze. Elise continued, her voice steady. Her name is Aria Nunez. She was 7 at the time. She remembers almost nothing about the fire. But she remembers the woman who carried her. She remembers you called her kiddo and said, "You'll be all right. Just keep breathing." She says that moment saved her life twice. I didn't move, not until the message ended. I didn't call back. Instead, I stared at the wall for what felt like hours. The motel hum filled the silence again. Fridge buzzing, AC clicking. But inside me, something had started to shift. That night, I opened the email Elise had sent. Just a link. No explanation. I clicked. It was an article. Not a news piece, more like a letter. Titled, "To the Woman Who Didn't Leave Me Behind." The byline read, Aria Nunez, age 19. The first lines hit me like a tremor. I don't remember her name. I don't even know if she was supposed to be there. All I know is that when my trailer collapsed and the fire reached the walls, I couldn't scream anymore. I thought I was going to die. But then arms found me. Strong arms. She smelled like smoke and peppermint. I clung to her neck like it was the only thing keeping me alive. Maybe it was. I kept reading. They told me later I was lucky. But I wasn't lucky. Someone made a choice. She made it. Against whatever rules told her not to. I heard the footage surfaced. I watched it 5 times, and I cried harder each time. If you're reading this wherever you are, I never got to say thank you. But I remember your voice. You called me kiddo, and I remember your rank. Because even in a panic, a 7-year-old can hear it. You were a colonel. You were my colonel. I had to put the phone down. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. But not from grief. It was something sharper, something healing. I hadn't heard anyone call me that title in years, not since the day I walked out of the hearing room at Fort Oak Ridge where they told me I'd violated protocol, that I had gone off script, that the civilians I saved had not been part of the mission parameters. I had watched them edit my name out of reports, had seen it disappear from commendation rosters. The medal that was supposed to be issued for Iron Veil had gone to someone else entirely, someone who never set foot in that burning corridor. But now, after all this time, the only person who remembered was the one I had saved. And somehow that mattered more. I picked up my phone, drafted a reply to Elise. I didn't hit send. Not yet. I just stared at the blinking cursor. Maybe I wasn't ready for the world to know who I was. But for the first time in years, I wasn't ashamed either. I was beginning to realize the silence I thought was strength might have been mistaken for absence. And absence, it erases people, even those who once wore the stars. I wasn't sure why I came back. The base in Idaho had long since stopped being called a base. Officially, it was a logistical support training site, but those of us who'd served there knew it as the last quiet post before the noise of war returned. After Iron Veil, I spent 6 months here packing supplies, signing off inventory, and trying to disappear in routine. It was the kind of place no one ever asked you what you'd been through. They just handed you a clipboard and let you move crates. The bus dropped me off at a gas station half a mile from the entrance. I walked the rest of the way. The winter air smelled of pine and something sharp, maybe ash carried from distant fields, maybe memory. Each step on the frozen gravel sounded louder than it should have. I didn't mind. I was used to silence being the noisiest companion. At the edge of the base's old perimeter was the community center, a square building of tan siding and faded murals painted by schoolchildren years ago. Someone had pinned up a banner by the door, Winter Remembrance Ceremony, honoring the forgotten. The forgotten. That felt close enough to my name. I didn't sign in, didn't wear anything but a neutral wool coat and jeans. My boots were scuffed, my fingers unpainted. I wasn't here to be recognized. I just wanted to see. Inside the chairs were those familiar folding plastic kind, white, slightly unstable. The crowd was modest, maybe 40 people all bundled in coats and soft layers. A few elderly veterans nodded at one another. Some younger people carried candles or wore lanyards marked volunteer. I took a seat in the very back corner close to the door. I let the speeches wash over me at first. Words like service resilience, disaster readiness, nothing new, nothing personal. A local official with perfect posture and memorized lines read names from a paper she didn't look at long enough to know. I thought of how many of those names were lost to reports I'd signed off on, lost to corridors I once secured, lost to silence. Then a woman approached the podium, young, no more than 20. She walked like someone who had been coached on how to hide nerves but hadn't quite mastered it. Her coat was a deep burgundy hands clasped tightly in front of her as she began. "My name is Aria Nunez," she said, voice slightly tight. "I was 7 years old during the Marrow Creek fires." I blinked. I don't remember everything she continued. Most of it is flashes. Red sky coughing, the sound of wood splitting. But I do remember her, the woman who carried me out. I've never known her name, but she held me like she knew me, like I was hers. And even though I was crying so hard I couldn't see, she said one thing I never forgot. "Just keep breathing, kiddo. I've got you." Her voice wavered. I felt the air in my chest thin. They told me later she went in when no one else would. That she wasn't supposed to. That someone higher up told her to stand down. But she didn't. She saved me, and then she disappeared. There was a pause. I always thought maybe I imagined her, that maybe she was just a story my brain told me so I wouldn't be afraid. But then, the footage came out. And she was real. And I knew in that moment that I owed my entire life to someone who never got credit, never got thanks. The room clapped. Some people stood, others wiped tears. I stayed seated. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I didn't know how to stand for something I had buried for so long. After the ceremony, people milled about, sipping lukewarm cider from foam cups and chatting in low tones. I drifted toward the edge of the parking lot where the lights buzzed quietly against the growing dusk. I stood near a flagpole, one hand in my coat pocket, the other resting lightly on the metal base. The stars were just beginning to peek through the blue. I didn't hear her approach. Not until her voice came. Soft, but certain. Colonel Langley. I turned. She was taller now, of course. No longer the child I remembered cradled in my arms, coughing soot fingers gripping my collar. Her hair was tied back, eyes wide with something that looked like awe. Or maybe disbelief. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She took one step forward. It's you. It really is. Behind her, a young army officer had followed clipboard in hand. He stopped mid-step, stared at me, then slowly set the clipboard down. He straightened. And then, he saluted. A full, formal, respectful salute. "Ma'am," he said, voice clear. "Were you part of Operation Iron Veil, I could have lied, could have nodded and let him believe I had the medals, the praise, the decorated ending. Instead, I said what I had carried for years. I didn't follow orders, I told him. I followed people's screams." He held the salute. "I read your report," he said. "The redacted version. The one we weren't supposed to see." His eyes didn't waver. "And I want you to know, I'm honored." Something shifted behind us. People had noticed. Candles still flickered from the ceremony. A few conversations paused. One man started clapping. Then another. I didn't wave. I didn't make a speech. I didn't break down. I just nodded. And for the first time in over a decade, I felt seen. Not because of the title, not because of the story, but because someone, finally, understood what it meant to choose people over protocol. And that maybe, just maybe, the quiet kind of courage could echo louder than any applause. I stayed in Idaho longer than I meant to. The motel near the base was nothing fancy. Thin walls, coffee that tasted like cardboard. But the quiet was different here. Not the kind that pressed on your ribs. The kind that let you hear yourself again. A few days passed. I took walks in the morning past rusted fences and pine groves. I found a small diner that still remembered how to cook bacon properly. I sat at the back away from windows with a notebook open, but nothing written inside. Then Elise messaged again. "I promise I'm not trying to push, but the video's now on 3 defense journalism sites. No one's named you. Everyone's guessing, but someone will find out soon. I wanted to give you a heads up first." I typed out a quick reply. "Let them guess. That's safer for all of us." She didn't argue, but she did send one more thing. Forwarded from Aria's address. "Hi, Elise. If she's still in Idaho, could you please ask if she'd join us for dinner? No cameras, no reporters, just me. And someone who wants to say something to her face to face. I know she doesn't owe me anything, but I'd really like to thank her properly this time." I stared at the message for a long while. Dinner. It felt too soft for the weight of what was still sitting between my ribs, but I owed that girl. Woman now. More than a silent exit. I replied with just 2 words. "I'll come." That Friday, I showed up at the address listed, an old bungalow just off a forested loop tucked behind tall evergreens and a winding driveway. It was snowing lightly. Arya opened the door before I knocked. She smiled like someone trying not to cry. I didn't hug her. I wasn't ready. But I stepped inside and she didn't press. The living room was warm, decorated modestly with photographs of landscapes and sketches of places I half recognized, burned towns rebuilt in color. A table had been set for 3. Candles, mismatched chairs, a ceramic bowl of roasted vegetables in the center. The 3rd chair was already occupied, and when I saw him, I paused mid-step. "Colonel Avery," I said quietly. He stood older than I remembered, but unmistakable. Tall, dignified, a scar across his jawline that hadn't been there when I last saw him. He had been a captain during my final deployment. One of the good ones. One of the few who didn't flinch when orders contradicted conscience. "Ma'am," he said and nodded, not formally, respectfully. "I wasn't told there'd be guests," I said carefully. I asked him. Arya cut in. He's the one who gave me the full report. The one no one else would show me." I raised an eyebrow. Avery looked me in the eye. "I recognized you in the video the moment I saw it," he said. "Even with the soot. Even with the years." I said nothing. Sat down. Dinner passed quietly at first. Roasted chicken. Warm bread. Arya filled the silences with soft questions. About the weather, my motel, a few innocent mentions of the past. But then as the plates cleared, Avery leaned forward. "They erased you," he said. "Not because you did wrong, but because your report made the rest of them look like cowards." I didn't answer. I was ordered not to speak of it, not to file any commendation, not to even mention your name in my exit debrief. My fingers wrapped around the mug of tea Arya had set in front of me. I watched the steam curl. "There are investigations now," he continued. "Quiet ones. Iron Veil's being reopened. Internal Affairs has started asking the right people the wrong questions." He looked at me carefully. "The kind of questions that lead back to you." I kept my voice even. And they should," he said. "I stayed silent back then because I thought I was protecting your dignity, your record. But now I wonder if I was protecting a lie instead." Arya looked between us, unsure whether to speak. I put the mug down. "I didn't ask anyone to fight for me," I said. "I signed my own papers." Nint. I walked away. Avery nodded. And yet here we are. The room was warm. Too warm. I stood paced, once hands in my coat pockets. "It's been years," I said. "What good does dragging up old truths do now?" He paused. "Sometimes the only way to clear a wound is to reopen it." I didn't reply. Arya walked me to the door after. She didn't hug me, but she slipped something into my hand. A folded note. "Thank you for saving me when no one else would, and thank you for coming back when you didn't have to. Whatever happens next, I'll still call you Colonel." I closed the car door in silence. As the engine warmed and the headlights lit the gravel path, one thought came and stayed. Maybe my silence isn't protecting them anymore. Maybe it's protecting the wrong side. The house was colder than I remembered. When I unlocked the door, the hallway light flickered the same way it always had. The carpet still carried the faint smell of pine and the must of unopened windows. No one had lived here but me for years, but I'd still left most of the rooms untouched, like relics of a life I wasn't sure how to keep or how to bury. I dropped my coat on the armrest, set my keys down beside the envelope Arya had given me, and stood in the quiet for a moment. I hadn't been back since before Houston. Now it felt different, like something inside the walls was listening. That night I couldn't sleep, not with Arya's words still echoing, not with Avery's gaze still steady in the back of my mind. So I went to the study, the one room in the house I had kept exactly the way it was the day after my husband's funeral. A wall of filing drawers, a locked steel cabinet, a faded flag and a shadow box. I stood before the drawers, hand hovering, unsure what I was even looking for. Then I opened the second to last one, the one marked simply Discharge Docs, 2013. Inside, manila folders thinned with age. I flipped through one after another until I found it Operation Iron Veil, Field Reports Original. I pulled it out slowly. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the ink remained sharp. My name was on the first page, typed clean at the top. Langley N., Lead Logistical Officer. Underneath it, assigned for Civilian Oversight Medical Supply Corridor. Bravo. But in the version they'd submitted later, my name was replaced with a vague title unit liaison. Temp Detail. The signature line was blank. I remembered that. They had redacted me from my own work. But I had kept this copy because something inside me had whispered I might need it one day. Not for revenge, for proof, for peace. Underneath the folder was another, one I didn't remember keeping. Civilian Status Report, Corridor Red Class. I opened it and stared. Names, rows of names, next to each a code, some marked cleared, others marked omit. A final column read Asset Proximity, flagged for delay. I knew what that meant. Those were the people we weren't supposed to save. Because they were too close to something. Or someone. The system didn't want exposed. I sat down, breath thin in my chest. And then, from pure muscle memory, I reached for the top drawer of the old wardrobe against the far wall. Inside were a few medals, a folded letter from my son when he was 10, and a field jacket I hadn't worn in a decade. In its inner pocket, I felt something hard. A USB stick. I held it up to the light. No label. Just a faint scratch across the surface. My fingers paused. This wasn't mine. It had belonged to Ray, my husband. The jacket had been his before I took it during a cold deployment in Poland. He had been a military engineer before he passed someone who never talked about work, someone I never asked much about once the treatments started. I plugged the USB into my laptop. At first it blinked, then loaded a single folder marked Archive, Elias V. Inside were subfolders, one marked Financials, another Contract Routing, another Audio, Cleaned, and then a final one, Veil Intercept. I opened the last. The screen filled with file names, dozens, reports, logs, memos with timestamps and officer initials. One labeled Reclassified Route Change, Asset Transfer. I clicked. The document laid out exactly what I had feared. Iron Veil had started as a humanitarian mission, but halfway through it was restructured. The priority shifted from civilian evacuation to classified cargo transport, the cargo being untraceable military assets, some marked for transfer to non-government actors under temporary custodial programs. My hands began to shake as I kept scrolling. Then I found it. An audio file labeled Strategic Call. Internal. I clicked it. Static. Then voices. One belonged to a man I'd only met once, General Marchison. The other, I wasn't sure, but the conversation was unmistakable. "We need her out," Marchison said flatly. "She's not playing along, no. She's field-led too visible. And the incident with the trailer girl, cameras caught it. If she goes in again, it's risk we can't absorb. Then redact the record. Erase her assignment. Already done." Silence. Then laughter. "She'll think she got shuffled out for protocol. She won't dig. They were wrong. I hadn't dug. But I had kept everything. I sat in that room for hours. I copied every file, backed up every memo, rescanned my original reports and appended digital timestamps. I encrypted the drive and created a secondary lock using Ray's old project key. A code only I knew from his private notebooks. I didn't call a lawyer. Didn't alert a news station. I didn't even text Elise. Not yet, because this wasn't about exposure. Not yet. It was about readiness. It was about not being erased again. And for the first time, in a long, long time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt prepared. The first message came on a Tuesday morning. I was pouring coffee, staring out the window at the early frost spreading across the garden beds, when the notification blinked across my laptop screen. From Tyler Langley. Subject, just wondering body. Hey, saw the video. That was you, right? Look, things were tense before. Maybe we could talk. Ty. I stood there for a long time, mug in hand, reading those 20 words over and over. No. Hi, Mom. No apology. No acknowledgement of what he'd said at the dinner table the last time we spoke. Just that single line, saw the video. So that's what brought him back. Not the years I spent waiting, not the birthdays missed, not the crushed scarf on the floor or the silence that followed. The video. The moment someone else saw me. I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. 3 days later, another email arrived. Subject, Dad's old stuff body. I was clearing out the garage and found some things of Dad's. Military files, old gear. There's a couple pieces that might be valuable. Want me to send them over? Could be worth keeping. Let me know. Ty. I read that one more slowly. Might be valuable. Not sentimental. Not important to you. Just worth something. I typed a brief reply. Sure. If you think it's worth sending. Hope you're doing okay. Mom. That was it. No wait. No opening. I had stopped asking for doorways that were never going to open. A week later, a small brown parcel arrived at my doorstep. No return label, just my name written in neat capital letters across the top. Langley. I brought it inside and set it on the table. Didn't open it for hours. Just let it sit there like a quiet stranger waiting to be acknowledged. When I finally cut the tape, the first thing I saw was a stack of Ray's field manuals, folded maps, one of his laminated badges from his years as a contractor, and tucked beneath them, wrapped in a rubber band, was the USB drive, the exact one I had stored 3 weeks ago, carefully encrypted, hidden in the back of a locked drawer. But this one looked different. It had been labeled in red Sharpie Cool Project, 2008. A little white note was stuck to the side. No envelope, just a torn piece of lined paper taped hastily to the casing. Saw this in your old stuff. Thought it looked cool. Ty. That was all. No mention of what it contained. No question about what it meant. No awareness that this object, this tiny cracked piece of plastic, could have ended careers, could have buried lives, could have put my name in places I hadn't wanted to go again. He had opened it. He had seen it. Or maybe worse. He hadn't. Maybe he plugged it in, skimmed a few files, shrugged and tossed it into a box marked junk. Just like the gift. Just like the scarf. Just like everything I ever tried to hand him with meaning. My breath caught in my chest. Not from anger, not from fear, but from something colder. Something older. Recognition. Tyler wasn't just careless. He wasn't just dismissive. He wasn't just young and distracted or swept up in his wife's preferences or their polished life of curated dinners and holiday photos. He didn't see me. He never had. He saw what I could provide, what I used to manage, what I was useful for, but he never once asked what it had cost me to wear that uniform, to carry those bodies, to be erased by the very system I swore to serve. And now, when someone else finally saw me, when strangers called me Colonel, when officers saluted and whispered thank you, he came back not with remorse, but with calculation. Maybe there's value here now. Maybe I should check in. Maybe this is finally something worth his time. I sat down at the table, the USB still in my palm. I didn't cry right away. It took a while. Tears didn't fall like a storm. They came quiet, like mist on glass, like the way the morning light falls through a room you forgot how to love. It wasn't grief. I had grieved him long ago, the boy who once called me his hero, the teenager who stopped inviting me to his school events, the man who told me I was just wasting space in his new life. No, This wasn't grief. This was clarity. For all the missions I'd completed, all the corridors I had cleared, all the civilians I'd dragged to safety, there was one person I could never reach. Because he never once turned around to see who was behind him. He just kept walking. And now I finally stopped following. I didn't announce my departure. Not to Elise, not to Aria, not even to the barista who had come to memorize how I took my coffee. No sugar, just milk. I packed a single overnight bag in silence. I triple-checked the lock on my drawer before leaving, not out of paranoia, but out of muscle memory from years of securing classified cases under desert moonlight. The flight to the was half full, the kind of crowd that left middle seats open and conversations minimal. I sat by the window and barely blinked for 2 hours, watching clouds stretch and dissolve over fields I no longer tried to name. Every mile forward felt like peeling away an old bandage, one I'd left on too long because I was afraid of what might still be bleeding beneath. I wasn't flying toward justice. That would have felt too righteous. I was flying toward accountability, and accountability rarely welcomed you with a parade. The address Colonel Avery had texted me was innocuous. No government office, no secure conference room, just a quiet corner cafe tucked between a yoga studio and a second-hand bookstore. Founding Grounds, it was called, like someone had tried to dress up the weight of democracy in artisanal espresso. I arrived 15 minutes early and still felt late. Avery was already there. Civilian clothes, gray coat, reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose like he'd worn them for decades, but had only started using them last year. He didn't wave, just looked up when I stepped in and nodded slightly like this meeting had been inevitable from the moment I turned down that hallway to save Aria. I sat across from him, hands folded, coat zipped high despite the indoor warmth. Coffee, he offered. I shook my head. No, I didn't come to catch up. He nodded again and reached into his coat pocket to slide a small leather notebook across the table. Inside, a slim packet of documents waited. Backgrounder on the task force, he'd mentioned non-disclosure protocols, the names of 3 people who would see my files, and only those 3. I didn't touch it. Instead, I opened my own folder. It was thicker, worn at the edges from being held too tightly for too many nights. I slid it over. Inside were the original hard copies of the Iron Veil Field Report, the red-lined civilian exclusion lists, the logs from the drive Ray had left behind. I'd printed every single page myself, even the ones I hadn't fully deciphered, just in case the metadata could be traced. Atop it all, I'd placed a fresh USB encrypted with dual layers, one under my former field access key, the other under Ray's retired engineering hash. You sure? Avery asked, glancing at the stack, but not yet opening it. Yes. He exhaled through his nose, a gesture that sounded more like regret than relief. They're still scared of you. You know, he said. They shouldn't be, I replied. I haven't raised a weapon in years. No, but you still carry one. He tapped the envelope. This is loaded. I didn't flinch. I'm not going to the press. I'm not giving speeches. Why not? He asked. After everything. Don't you think it's time people saw the full picture? I looked at him and for the first time since sitting down let the emotion crack slightly through my voice. I don't want to be a symbol. They already turned me into that without my consent. I want to be a source. Quiet. Undeniable. Useful. He paused. We can protect your name. But not perfectly. Just don't spotlight it, I said. Let the evidence speak louder than the witness. He nodded again. Slower this time. We'll assign a review officer. You won't have to testify unless formally summoned, and even then, your status allows for closed session protection. I don't care about the process I interrupted. I care about results. If these papers go into another drawer, if they disappear behind another acronym, they won't, he said firmly. Not this time. The conviction in his voice was real, But I had lived long enough to know that conviction alone didn't change systems. It took pressure, persistence, and someone willing to stand in the dark without asking to be applauded for it. As I stood to leave, he didn't shake my hand. He just whispered, "I'm sorry it had to take this long." I didn't respond. Oh, because the truth was, it didn't have to. But no one had wanted to look closely until a little girl screamed under a collapsing roof and someone caught it on tape. I left the cafe and walked 3 blocks before I realized I didn't know where I was going. My flight back wasn't until evening. I could have filled the hours with museums or bookstores or even a long lunch in DuPont Circle. Instead, I found myself at the river. There's a path near the Navy Yard where I used to run after briefings years ago. I walked that same path now, boots crunching over gravel, and tried to remember who I was the last time I stood here. Young, ambitious, utterly convinced that doing the right thing would always feel good. It didn't. Sometimes it felt like betrayal. Sometimes it felt like setting yourself on fire just to make the shadows move. But today, it felt clean. Not triumphant, not healed, just clean. By the time I boarded the plane home, the sun was folding itself gently behind a line of clouds, and the cabin lights were dim. I sat by the window again this time with a folded scarf in my lap, the same one I had rescued from the floor the night my son sneered and called my gift cheap. The stewardess offered me a drink. I asked for tea. As we took off, I thought of the recruits I had trained. Dozens of them, maybe more. Young, unshaped, full of fire. They always came in thinking leadership meant barking orders. I spent more time teaching them how to hold silence than how to fire a weapon. Because in the real world, it's not volume that cuts through chaos. It's clarity. It's steadiness. It's choosing, over and over, to hold your integrity when everyone else is letting theirs slip like water through open fingers. That's the only kind of command that lasts. That's the kind I still believe in. As the cabin lights dimmed and the clouds thickened outside the window, I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a name erased from a page. I felt like a page finally being turned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't raise my hand. I just raised the truth. I didn't go back. Not to the base. Not to the hearings. Not even to the inbox where my security clearance once lived behind layers of encryption and rank. They never reinstated me. There was no formal apology, no ceremony to reattach the medals, no phone call saying we were wrong. The system doesn't work that way. And by then I no longer needed it to. Instead, I took what remained of my pension and bought a narrow stretch of land near the foothills of Wyoming. 30 acres of frost-bitten brush and wind-swept quiet. No fences. Just sky, just space. I named it the Quiet Field. Not because it sounded poetic, but because there were no banners, no slogans, no healing retreats printed on brochures, just a small cabin, a clearing for campfires, a training loop for those who still needed to feel their legs burn to know they were alive. I welcomed veterans first, men and women who had seen too much, said too little. Then slowly I opened the doors to girls, young women, survivors, some from deployments, some from foster care, some from things they never gave words to. We didn't ask for stories. We taught them how to tie knots, how to read the stars, how to purify water, how to patch torn tents, torn skin, torn hearts. There was a rhythm to the silence here, not emptiness, just space to breathe. Sometimes I'd sit by the fire at night, the logs crackling, and watch them laugh. Real laughter, the kind you can't fake. And I'd think this is what I wanted all along. Not recognition, just renewal. One afternoon in early winter, Aria came. I saw her before she knocked. Her car climbing the gravel road like a question she didn't know how to ask. She stepped out wearing a windbreaker and boots too clean for the mud here. In her hands, a sealed envelope. I met her halfway. "It's from Elise," she said, holding it out like it weighed more than paper should. I took it without opening it right away. We sat on the porch, said nothing for a while. The wind carried the scent of pine and old snow. She didn't know how to call, Arya said eventually. She thought maybe this was safer. I nodded. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, I opened it under the reading lamp in the corner of the cabin. The handwriting was Elise's. Neat, deliberate, like someone who rewrote every sentence twice before putting it down. She apologized. Not for her silence, not for her absence, but for never asking. I thought you were okay, she wrote. You always looked okay. You didn't cry. You didn't yell. You just kept showing up, and I let that become the whole story. She told me about Tyler, about how she'd let his version of me define their marriage because it was easier than confronting her own. I let him decide who you were, and I'm ashamed of that. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said thank you. I didn't write back. Not yet. Instead, I printed the letter, folded it clean, and placed it in a wooden box in the reading room. Right next to a compass Ray once gave me and a photo of Arya at age 9, arms covered in dirt, holding a fishing pole twice her height. The girls sometimes ask me who I was before. They ask if I was really a colonel or if the rumors are just stories made big around the fire. I never correct them. I never list the operations or the titles or the things I carried. I just say I was someone who showed up when others didn't. And that's all they need. On the last night of every month, we build a new fire. No phones, no photographs, no speeches. Just warmth. Just faces lit by flame and trust. And as I sit there among them, calloused hands and hopeful eyes, I don't feel erased. I don't feel bitter. I feel real. Not a war hero, not a name on a wall, just a woman who remembered how to hold a promise, and held it until the world made room. If this story touched something in you, maybe a memory, a silence, or a truth you've carried quietly for years, then I want to thank you for listening. Have you ever given someone your best only to be met with indifference? Or worse, shame, have you ever felt like your story didn't matter until someone else decided it did? You're not alone. There are so many of us, mothers, daughters, quiet fighters, who've spent years showing up without being seen. And sometimes all it takes is a moment like this to remember that our worth was never up for debate. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of quiet strength, deep heartbreak, and the dignity of starting over, please consider subscribing to the channel and tapping the notification bell. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the loudest. They're the ones whispered by women who never stopped showing up. And those stories deserve to be heard.